Hello, my name's Roger Watson and I'm the Professor of Nursing in the Faculty of Health Sciences at the University of Hull. This is being delivered for the Hull York Medical School as part of their Medicine with a Gateway year for the module Medical Scholarship. And this is one of two sessions on writing for different purposes. So, writing for different purposes. There are many different kinds of writing, as I'm sure you're already aware. Academic writing, scientific writing, journalistic writing, editorials, literary, poetic. There may well be other styles. These days we've got the inclusion of things like microblogs and blogs and other forms of communication. What I want to get across here is that these different styles of writing are not actually all that different. We do tend to teach students to think about academic writing as something particularly special and as being different from other styles of writing. And to some extent it is. Clearly, you wouldn't write an academic piece of work, an essay or a paper for publication in the same way as you might write a letter to a friend or an email to a friend. However, anything that you're submitting for assessment or putting out into the public domain has got some similar aspects to it. And I will iterate and reiterate one of the most important aspects of any kind of writing is that it is concise and full of meaning and as readable as possible. And in this session, I'm going to look at some ways of achieving that and also to give you some examples of kinds of writing that display this. I'm specifically going to use the Conversation, which is an online newspaper written by academics for the general public, because I think it demonstrates some excellent aspects of good writing, and I'm also going to show you some editorials. As I said in the introduction, I'm the Professor of Nursing in the Faculty of Health at the University of Hull, so I'll use some examples from my own field, and in fact I'm going to show you some examples of my own writing there. Now, I've been in academia for a long time and I've written under all of these different kinds of writing here: academic, scientific, journalistic, editorial, literary, and even poetry. I've written, edited and been edited in all of them. And just to reiterate, the common denominator in these is concise writing, full of meaning, that's as readable and understandable by as wide a cross-section of the population as possible. In my view, there are only two kinds of writing: good writing and poor writing. And there is a chasm between them, maybe not as big as this chasm here, which I think is the Grand Canyon, but there is a chasm between them. You usually know good writing and poor writing when you see it. What you need to develop in your academic career and indeed in your medical career is to achieve good writing that's clear, and we hope in these sessions on academic scholarship to help you to achieve that and to move from the right hand side of this PowerPoint, the poor writing side, to the good writing side. Now, I'm not sitting here claiming to be a good writer and claiming that you are all poor writers. We can all be good writers and we can all be poor writers. Sometimes I don't write quite as well as others and I need help, usually from an editor in a journal, to make it better. I think it's okay when I send it in and it comes back heavily edited and I realise, it could have been better and now it is better. But sometimes I get it right, and I'm sure you're the same. But what we want to reach is a situation where we can turn our own poor writing into good writing. So we don't have to write things perfectly first time every time. We can write down what we think, what our thoughts are, what our impressions are, what we want to convey, for example, in an essay, get it down as quickly as possible, and then we can take time deliberately to make it better. Now I know that being a student, or being students, and I used to be one myself, that very often we do things at the last minute and we don't have time to revise them. And I would really strongly advise you to try not to get into that situation. Try to leave yourself some time to revise your writing. It really shows when writing has not been sorted out and not been shortened and not been made better. It really shows up when people are reading this. And if writing is not good and not easy to understand, then it's going to be difficult to mark and to read, and it will be difficult for you to achieve good marks. So good writing is a great help to achieving better academic grades. But it could also be very important later in your career, as doctors or beyond that, as possibly as academics, in writing and publishing what you find, for example, in research. But even during your time practicing medicine, you will be required to write reports and case reports and notes on patients. And all of these can be written either poorly or written well. And again, in this session, I want to try to help you to write as well as possible and to show you some examples of how to do that, and also to show you some examples of what I consider to be good writing. So good writing should be easy to understand, simple and succinct, organised and well laid out, and interesting to keep the reader's attention. All these things are, of course, are easy to say, aren't they? Easy to understand. Well, how do you achieve that? And without doubt, I think the way to achieve making things easy to understand is to make them as short as possible, to get rid of unnecessary words, to avoid writing with expressions that other people don't understand. I'll come back to some of these points later. And also to use sentences which aren't too long. Again, I'll emphasize that and show you how that affects your writing later. Simple and succinct. I'm going to talk a little bit about that and how to do that. Organisation and well laid out. Organised and well laid out. That's very important in writing. If you read scientific papers, which you may not have looked at yet, but you will look at them very soon, or papers, for example, in the Lancet or the BMJ, you'll notice that these are organised under headings and subheadings, and they're well laid out. The writing isn't crammed together. There are fairly wide margins. There's a nice large font. These things are superficial, but they're very important. And the organisation of a paper is also very important. It's very important to orient the reader and to take you from the beginning to the end of the article and to know where to put certain kinds of material. For example, if you're writing an introduction, where the introductory material goes and so forth, and if you're writing a discussion, what should go into that discussion. So the organisation of a paper is very important, and it's also very important in pieces of academic work for assessment. There seems to be, certainly in my faculty, amongst some colleagues, an idea that essays should not have headings and subheadings. I completely disagree with this, and it's not something that I've ever been brought up to understand. However, even if when you're being assessed and you must do what you're told in your assessments, or maybe what you've learned at school, even if you are instructed not to use headings and subheadings in essays, I think it's always a good idea to put them in, for example, an introduction and so forth, and a conclusion. And if you are instructed not to use them, take them out, but the organisation will still be there. And of course, things have got to be interesting to keep readers' attention, and we'll have a look at how that can be achieved as well. Now, this is meant to be a joke, as indicated by the smiley face at the top left. However, as I said at the beginning, we do tend, and there's a lot of evidence that we do tend to teach students in such a way, and my own subject of nursing, which is relatively new in academia, seems to suffer from this, that we tend to tell students that they need to write in a particular way that's academic, using long sentences and big words. It simply isn't true. Now, the sentence in front of us there makes perfect sense. Well, sorry, it makes sense but it doesn't make perfect sense. It says here, don't use a big word when a singularly unloquacious and diminutive linguistic expression will satisfactorily accomplish the contemporary necessity. What it really means is don't use big words when short ones will do, and it's using a joke to make that point. So don't write like this, write like I said it if you're trying to express this particular idea. Don't use a big word when a short one will do. Use clear, simple writing. I'm going to give you 3 pointers here, but it just happens to be the case that there's an example on the slide which is just meant to exemplify this. This is a sort of question that you might ask a parent in a clinic, or you might put it on a questionnaire to screen people when they arrive at your clinic. With what frequency has your child experienced a raised temperature within the last 30 days? Compare that with the sentence below. How many times has your child had a fever in the last month? Which one do you think is better? Well, I'll tell you, there's no doubt that the one at the bottom is better. The tick kind of gives that away, obviously. The one at the top is too long. That's the main problem with it. There are too many words. But it uses words like frequency, experienced, raised temperature, last 30 days. Not very familiar terms to lay people. You've still got to write correctly, but use expressions that are more normal, more common, more commonly used by lay people. So how many times has your child had a fever in the last month? Almost anyone could answer that question. It's instantly become more readable. Often the first word that comes to mind is the right one. So what I mean here is don't try to look for a more impressive word. Don't seek to use polysyllabic words. Now an example here would be, I'm looking out my window at the moment as it happens, and I could tell you that I just watched a car going past. Now if I was going to write that down and think, well, that doesn't really sound very clever or impressive, I'm going to say it in this way. I'm going to say, I watched an automobile proceeding along the highway or something like that. You know, it doesn't help, and you don't need to do that. It isn't more impressive, and nobody expects you. None of your academic assessors, no editor of a journal or anything you're writing expects you to do that. Editors will always get rid of that kind of writing. You know the cliched way in which policemen speak in trials on the television. No disrespect to police, and I've got absolutely no idea if they actually do this or not, but they say things like, I watched the suspect proceeding along the road in a northerly direction. You know, I said, I don't know why they do that, or if they even do that, but that's the sort of thing that they seem to be doing this to make an impression. So don't seek to use polysyllabic words, don't use big ones when short ones will do. Another hint related to this, not quite the same, but related to this, is how to keep writing, because all these hints and tips are all very well, but you've got to write something in order to be able to edit it and to look at it and make it better. So try not to get stuck when you're writing. If you're writing something medical and you may need a technical term or a correct technical term, you may get to a point where you think, oh, I can't remember the word for that. I can't remember what that disease is called or something like that. I can't remember what the organ is called. Don't get stuck. Put an asterisk in and put a note of what you're trying to remember and move on. And that way you won't get blocked and you'll keep writing. So the example I give is if you can't remember the word for elephant, put in brackets, large animal, long nose, big ears, move on, come back to it. So what the adage here from editors is and from good writers is, write and don't edit as you write. Edit later. And don't use jargon. And this is particularly true of us. By us, I mean us clinicians, medics and nurses. We tend to use jargon. And jargon's okay between professionals. Jargon really means language that's understood by a limited number of people, and it is often used for shorthand purposes and such like, but try not to use jargon. For example, in the boxes there, if you said how many times has your child had a pyrexia in the last month, well, pyrexia is a perfectly correct term, but it's understood by few people, by physiologists, medics, nurses, that kind of thing. So that would probably count as jargon. So try to use everyday words and try to use them in every kind of writing that you do. Now, there's an excellent book by Helen Sword about writing with style, and I actually don't think I've given you it as a reference, but it's easy to find. It's a very short book, and it's actually very well worth getting. It's a short book, and it's written by this particular academic from the University of Auckland in New Zealand, Helen Sword, and it's not just a piece of thinking, it's actually a scientific study of different kinds of writing from different disciplines, including medicine and nursing. And she gives some examples in there of ways in which you can improve your writing. She does give these bits of advice to use short or mixed length sentences. Keep your sentences as short and as simple as you can, but also try and vary the rhythm. Don't have them all too short or staccato. It doesn't work too well either. I don't know about writing in any other language but English, but I do know that some other languages take many more words. The Latin languages, French, certainly Spanish and Italian, use many more words than we do. And I'm not entirely sure what the best way is writing in those languages, but I do know about English, which you will be writing in for your assessments and for most scientific papers. So try to vary the sentences in length, but certainly try not to make them too long, and I'm going to give us specific examples of this later. Try to use plain English. I've said this already. Avoid ornate, pompous, Latinate, words using Latin expressions, or waffly prose. Don't say things like ad hominem when you meet of the person or whatever. Just try to keep it simple. I don't have time to give too many examples here, but I'm sure you'll know it when you see it in other people's writing and try to recognize it in your own. Try to use active verbs. I'll give you one example of this very shortly. Avoid passive verbs and use them sparingly. Active verbs should predominate. I'll give you an example of that later. Passive writing is actually quite difficult to avoid. We're all very guilty of it. A really good example, and you'll see this in scientific papers, is the researcher did this, or the research team did this next, that kind of thing. Now, there's no need to do that unless journals specifically don't accept that kind of writing. That's passive writing. It's much better to say I did it and we did it. And most major publishers, and I'm including Wiley, Nature publishing, they will accept the first person, and it leads to more active writing. Try to tell a story, create a compelling narrative. I work with a very senior academic psychologist and psychiatrist, and he's very well published, done some very important studies on cognitive function in older people, and I've done some work with him. Whenever we have the results of a study, his first words are, when we come to writing the paper, what is the story here? I always find that very, very interesting. What's the story? How do we tell a story? Now, again, we can't go into that, an example of that here. We can't expand on that here. But one of the easiest ways to do this is to remember what you probably learned when you were doing essays at school and reading and possibly writing short stories. Everything should have a beginning, a middle and an end, and that's one of the best ways to create a compelling narrative. Make sure that the introductory stuff comes at the beginning, some summary stuff comes at the end, and the main body comes in the middle. Don't add things in at the end that you forgot to put in at the beginning. Put them at the beginning. That's just a simple way of creating a compelling narrative. However, there's more to it than that, but really, I think one way of doing it is to read over what you've done and think, is this interesting? Is it going to hold someone's attention? If not, try and make it better. If you're not sure, give it to somebody else to have a quick look at. Now, there's an English writer, you've possibly heard of him. His real name was Eric Blair. He wrote under the name of George Orwell, and he was a journalist by training, and journalists are some of the best writers around. If you haven't heard of him, I'm sure you've heard of 1984, a film made in the early 80s, based on one of his political books, and there's also a book called Animal Farm, which certainly used to be on the syllabus at school when my children were there. Another political book. Those are famous books of his, but he also wrote many novels. So he says, never use a metaphor, simile, or other figure of speech which you are used to seeing in print. I'll just read that again because many people misread it. Never use a metaphor, simile, or other figure of speech which you are used to seeing in print. So try not to ape the style of other people and the way that some people write, and certainly the way that some people speak. And the examples that are given, this is one web page expounding on Orwell's 5 rules. There are several websites to my knowledge. Things like towing the line, riding roughshod over, standing shoulder to shoulder with, playing into the hands of, an axe to grind, Achilles heel, swan song, hotbed. You can probably think of more at the end of the day, and sweeping under the carpet, all these sort of things. They're cliches as well, which means they're kind of empty phrases, empty calories as I like to call them. So try not to use them, try to say what you mean. Towing the line means to obey, ride roughshod over, ignore. So don't use these things. You will see them creeping in, not so much into good journalism, but you might see them in columns and written by some journalists, but try not to follow that style. It doesn't help. Never use a long word where a short one will do. I've said that before, and I'll say it again. Problem is that longer words don't make you sound intelligent unless you use them skillfully, but they're better not necessarily to be used at all, and they'll have the opposite effect if you use them badly. They'll make you sound pretentious, arrogant, and worst of all, might make you look stupid and make you look like you don't actually know what you're talking about and that you're trying to cover up using impressive looking words. But the real problem is they're much less likely to be understood, and they're more awkward to read. Anything which makes a reader jump on the page while they're reading something will detract from what you're trying to do. If it's possible to cut out a word, always cut it out, and I absolutely 100% agree with this. I cannot emphasize this enough, and that's one of the main things I'm going to show you here. Ezra Pound, a famous American writer, said, "Great literature is simply language charged with meaning to the utmost possible degree." Thinking of that carefully, it really just means taking out the stuff that detracts from trying to convey your meaning. So words that don't contribute always dilute it. So less is always better, always better. And I completely agree with that. Some people have argued with me on Twitter about this, but as an editor, I think they're wrong, and my writing's always been improved by other people cutting out the unnecessary words. It's good academic practice. It's good writing. Never use the passive when you can use the active. I think I gave an example of this already, but this is difficult to do. But for example, the man was bitten by the dog is passive. That's 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 words. The dog bit the man. That's 5 words, and it's active. What I like most about it is it uses fewer words. That's the main thing, that's the main way in which it's more easy to read, but it's also more direct. It's more obvious what's happened here. Finally, there are no examples here. Never use a foreign phrase, a scientific word, or a jargon word if you can think of an everyday English equivalent. It's a little bit like his first rule, but it just says never do it. Just always look for an English everyday equivalent in your writing. And there's a URL there if you want to check out that particular blog, which I think is still there, but I'm pretty sure there are other examples of 5 rules for effective writing by Orwell. They're often referred to, and there are many examples there which can be helpful to you. Now this next section is on losing words, and what I'm going to do here is to use a couple of examples later of where I've cut down words, and I'm going to show you how to make use of this in assessing and improving your own writing. But first, some examples from Helen Sword, a couple of simple examples. Avoiding there can be one way to improve your writing. So this is a terrible sentence, I'm afraid to say, but it does make sense. But it says here, if the nomocentric principle is correct, then there are as many true backward counterfactual conditionals as there are forward counterfactual conditionals, and therefore the thesis that an asymmetry of counterfactual dependence characterizes our world would turn out to be false. I have absolutely no idea what that means, and it doesn't really matter. It does have some fairly big words repeated there, like counterfactual. However, it's meant to demonstrate what you can do by getting rid of there. And it reads now by getting rid of those theirs, which are clumsy, additional words. They make the sentence run on, and when you read those words frequently, there's only two of them there, but if they're overused, it can make the writing difficult to read. So here it now says, if the nomocentric principle is correct, then there are as many backward counterfactual conditions as forward counterfactual conditionals exist. Sorry, I didn't read that properly. If the nomocentric principle is correct, then as many true backward counterfactual conditionals as forward counterfactual conditionals exist. Full stop. So it's broken it down into two sentences. And then, therefore, the thesis that an asymmetry of counterfactual dependence characterizes our world would turn out to be false. It's slightly easier to understand, although I'm not exactly sure what it's going on about. But you see, you get the idea. Getting rid of there can be very useful. Avoiding that. In a series of important papers, John Broome has argued that the only sense of should at work here is the one that we use in saying what there is most reason or decisive reason to do, and that the apparent contradiction in the example is removed when we make appropriate distinctions of scope. Another very complex academic-y kind of sentence, I'm afraid to say. But again, you simply get rid of the that's, and you don't need them at all. And you can see that, well, for a start, it's got rid of a line. And in a series of important papers, John Broome has argued the only sense of should at work here is the one we use in saying what is the most reason. It's much easier to read, much easier to read. I'm not going to give you an example here, but it's also a good idea to go through and check every definite article. The definite article is the, and the can often go from your writing. It can often go from the beginning of sentences. But as I say, don't worry too much about that when you're actually writing something. Write it down, but look out for the definite article. We tend to use them too often. What I'm going to do now is to give you a demonstration of using a couple of sites which are very useful to check your writing. And I'm going to do this with an example and the actual sites on the internet. This is just on the PowerPoint here. One site is the Writer's Diet, which happens to be created by Helen Sword, whose work we've looked at already. This helps you with some very specific examples of writing. Then we're going to look at what's called the Readability Test tool. This runs a number of tests, but the main test here is the FLESH test, F-L-E-S-C-H test. I'm going to show you how to run that and what the value of doing this is with your writing. Now you may think that do people really use these? Yes, they do. They use these, and they also use sites like Grammarly. I haven't used Grammarly, but as far as I can see, because it's heavily advertised on YouTube, for example, that I'm guessing that you need to part with some money to use it. I don't know if there's free versions for students to use. I hear it's good, but I haven't used it myself. But the great thing about these is these are very easy to use and they are completely free. And if you're working in the National Health Service, the Readability Test tool, or the FLESH test, is directly relevant to you. If you're writing a patient information sheet, which I have done both for mostly for research, but for clinical areas as well, the FLESH test is the test that's used to test the readability. And if you're writing research proposals and writing ethical proposals where there are lay people on the panel, you'll be asked to write a lay statement. Take that statement and run it through the FLESH index and see how readable it is. And if it's not readable, try and make some improvements to it. I mentioned earlier, and I'm going to show you the example of the Conversation newspaper. The Conversation newspaper aims for maximum readability, and while you can't use the readability test, it's only accessible once you've written something for the Conversation, but that gives you also an idea of how readable your writing is and where it could be improved. So it uses it's similar to the test that I'm showing you here, but it's a bit of a hybrid between the two. But it's not accessible unless you're actually writing for the conversation. We'll come back to the conversation later. What I'm going to do now is to show you how to use these online readability tests, and for this you will need the 2 word reduction exercises if you want to do this yourself, and also the handout. If I click on the handout and I go to, first of all, right to the bottom, I've got a link to the writer's diet and one to the flesh test. So first of all, let's take a look at the writer's diet. Okay, that's come up rather nicely. I will open the 2 documents, word reduction exercise. I'll put before on top and after below it. Before. This is an example of some writing I did quickly about concise writing and how to do it, and it's 166 words long. Then I went through deliberately to shorten that and got it down to 102 words, reducing the length by 38%. Well, very good. So how does that help us? Well, let me just minimize those just now, and this, I'll maximize the page so that it's easier to see. Now, the writer's diet is very easy to use. There's a space here into which you can paste text. So let me first of all take the long version. I'll just take the main text from here, not the title and not the number of words, and copy and paste it in here. And then I'm going to run the test and the results will show up here. Right, those are the results. Basically, the work is flabby. That's not good. It's got 5 zones: exceedingly happy, okay, sorry, happy, okayish, unhappy, very unhappy. Luckily, none of my writings reached the very unhappy stage here, but it counts the number of be verbs. Is, for example, be, zombie nouns, regularity, information. I'm not entirely sure what a zombie noun is, to be absolutely honest. Regularity may be zombie because it's a little bit clumsy. Prepositions, to, with, over. Add words, increasingly, parsimony, essential. These are sort of superlative words. Those are the ones which I've used a lot of, and the test is not very happy with that. And then it, this, that, there. A few of those as well. But basically most of it's in the okay-ish stage. The zombie nouns, okay, I haven't used too many of them, so I'm not going to worry too much about them. And I'm going to find out what they mean later as well. But the add words are up here. So I've run the test and it's flabby. What I'm going to do is I'm going to open up a second web page with the same test in it so that we can compare directly, and I'm going to now paste in the reduced version. Now just bear in mind that I wasn't aiming here to do anything in particular other than lose words. I wasn't aiming to address any of these issues, but simply by losing words you'll see how much better it is. Run the test and look at that. It's like what I want to be, but I'm not. Fit and trim, and everything's no higher than the sort of happy enough zone. I've reduced the certain verbs. Zombie nouns remain the same. I've got rid of the add words. That's the main thing. Let me just go back and we can compare them directly. So this is the flabby one, and that's the fit and trim one. Is that there? That remains the same, but it's still in the middle zone. So that's a very easy test to run, and in fact it gives you clear guidance of where you can cut things down. So you could look and say, well, these words need to go, and how can we get rid of them? The other thing that it did here, instead of writing long sentences, I created shorter sentences, but this test doesn't show you that. Okay, so that's the writer's diet, and I think you will find that very easy to use and very, very useful. I'm going to close that down now, and using the same examples, I'm going to look at the flesh test essentially. And I'll do exactly the same thing here. Just to get started, I'll open it up twice so that we can use it twice, so we can do a direct comparison. So first of all here, you can test by URL. You can take the URL for a piece of writing and put it in, but that's not all that useful. Test by referrer, it's about reading, I'm not very sure. So open up the handout again and go to the flesh test. Just to get ahead of the game here, open the page up twice. Go back to this page here. Now you can test by pasting in URLs or by direct input. There are other buttons here which you can ignore, but I tend to, well, I only use the direct input. We're going to use that here. I'll open up that in both of the web pages. Now here you can see that it looks similar to the other test. It's got an area to paste in texts. So let's take the long piece, copy it and paste it in there and see what it does. Hold on. I've made a mistake. I'm going to start again. Copy that. Make sure that that's it. I'm going to make sure that you paste it over the text that's already there. And then you can calculate the readability by clicking on that, and it does this quickly, and it gives me my text as an average age, an average grade level about 22. It doesn't give me an age range, so that means it's outside of the useful range of readability essentially. It gives you other tests here. The Flesh Kincaid reading ease, the Flesh Kincaid grade level, the test number here is 11, and it gives you the various test statistics down here. 3 sentences, 166 words, complex words 27, percentage of complex words 16.27%, average words per sentence 55, that's far too long, I can tell that already, average syllables per word. So I'll leave that there so that those results are visible and go to the other web page and paste in the short piece of writing. As I say, make sure you paste it over that pre-existing bit of text, and here calculate the readability. And you can see immediately that things have improved. The text has an average grade level of about 16. It should be easily understood by 21 to 22-year-olds. That's more or less where you want to aim things. You might want to come a little bit down from that. The reading level in the conversation is reckoned to be about the reading level of an educated school leaver, which is slightly younger. But you can see, we'll compare the two things directly here. The test score is much higher. It's 39 here, which is much better. Look down at the test statistics. Still got 3 sentences, but there's only 102 words in the shorter version. There are only 15 as opposed to 27 complex words, and the percentage of complex words has dropped a little bit to 14, and the number of words per sentence, which was 55 here, has dropped down to 34. Now I think it's worth bearing in mind, as I think I said with the other test, I didn't do any of this deliberately to achieve those scores. I did this for another exercise completely. All I did here was to cut down the words to make it shorter as a demonstration of how to cut down words. But by cutting down words, you can achieve much greater readability, and that's really what I want to convey here today. So those are 2 online tools, free to use. You've got the links and you can use them anytime. In this next section, I want to consider editorials and the conversation. and I'm going to do the conversation first and then the editorials as it happens. I'm showing you these because they're a particular kind of writing, short and succinct. And while you may think, well, this doesn't apply to what I'm doing, I'm being asked to do 2,000 to 3,000 word essays, but what if you write 5,000 words and you need to cut it down? How do you make things more short and succinct? And the styles of writing in editorials, which are opinion pieces that front up some academic journals and newspapers every day have editorials, these are written in a very succinct style to convey important ideas very, very quickly. And the conversation, as I've said already, is a newspaper for lay readership written by academics. Academics, however, are not always good at getting their ideas across to the public, and that's precisely why the conversation exists. So we'll look at some examples there in just a minute. So first of all, the conversation. The conversation tells potential authors what type of stories they are looking for. So the conversation focuses on three priority areas: timely, evidence-based analysis of issues making the news, such as new research. And this is, I think, usually primarily what it's used for. It's used by academics to convey their research. And I'll show you an example of that from my own research. At the moment, however, it's mostly evidence-based analysis of issues making the news, and as I'm putting this presentation together, it's during the COVID pandemic, and the conversation is more or less given over to articles on COVID, and a great many articles have been published. Other articles have slightly been squeezed out, but it's being skewed by the particular time that we're in at the moment while I'm making this presentation. Perhaps by the time you're listening to this, that situation will have resolved. They also look for what are called timeless, as opposed to timely, plain English explainers of complex issues. Look at some examples of that. They look at sort of questions that school children might ask, and how would you explain something to a school child. And in-depth series or specials, hard evidence stories. These are usually longer, commissioned, written by much more prominent figures than people perhaps like myself, who might write some of the other articles. I've written timely, evidence-based analysis and timeless pieces as well. They're usually limited to 700 words, so they're very short. The in-depth pieces are usually longer. Now, you will not be able to write in the conversation unless you have a valid university email, and I think the rules are that you have to be at least a postgraduate student. I'm not sure how they verify that, but you cannot write from a Hotmail or a Gmail or anything like that. You have to register, and it has to be a recognised university email. And you don't just write and send things in. They have a process of pitching an article, and you can click on that link and it will take you to where you're asked to pitch the article. And there are three boxes which ask, in 50 words, what's this article about? In 100 words, why is it important? What are you going to say? And then another box, what sort of supporting evidence might you have for this? And they do like to have links and URLs, hyperlinks within the articles, and if possible, YouTubes and other material to support the articles. So you've got to pitch all that, and if you're lucky, as I've been on some occasions, but most occasions I haven't been lucky, you'll be asked to write your article, and you've got to write it quickly, and you've got to process it and make it as readable as possible. So while you may not be able to write in the conversation, I would strongly urge you to register with it. Anybody can register and get a daily email bulletin, and it really is a very good way of keeping up with all sorts of news, and especially in health and medicine. Here I want to take a look at, first of all, the conversation and then some editorials, and just look at some features of these types of publication. First of all, let's take a look at the conversation landing page. Conversation. Here we are. home. That's it. So here we see today's landing page. This is the 20th of January 2021, and you can see that main feature is on presidential inauguration, which is taking place today. One or two other articles here, male versus female brains, but you don't have to go far at this present time to find a COVID article, and other articles, coronavirus variants and such like. So there's lots of different articles here. Interesting to see. I'll get rid of the strap at the top. Interesting. I'm not signed in, because if I sign in, all sorts of other things pop up. But you can become an author, sign up as a reader, and that's what you should do. Sign up as a reader. You can get a daily bulletin. Here it says academic rigor, journalistic flair. What the conversation tries to achieve is to get across fairly complex academic concepts from research, the explainers, and also in-depth articles, but in a way that is readable, as I said, to an educated school leaver. So let's have a look at some examples that I've put in the handout. I'll get rid of that there. I'm going to use the examples in the handout because I'm familiar with them, and they illustrate some other things that I want to show. So here's one, a recent one: COVID vaccines. How do we know they'll work, and how do we know that they'll be safe? And this illustrates the sort of main features of the conversation, which make it, in my mind, very readable. You can see there's lots of different categories at the top. Health and medicine in the future might be the one that interests you most, but it's always got an attractive picture at the top, something that conveys exactly what is being written about, and you don't choose that. That's done by the editors at the conversation. And then this particular kind of title here, which is nice and clear to read, usually fairly short. It tells you who's written the article. This is Adam Klazowski from Strathclyde University, and usually there's a profile photograph there, and it gives disclosures as well. So it aims for transparency, so that if there are any vested interest and conflicts of interest, they ought to be declared there. Now, one of the things about the conversation articles is they tend to be short. They tend to be no more than a couple of pages of the internet. This one is slightly longer. This was a headlining article because of the importance of the vaccines, but you can see that it's nicely presented. You don't have to scan too far across the page. It's in a nice, easy to read column, and of course you can increase the size of it using the tools on your computer, but it's easy to read as it is. Nicely broken up into attractive and informative headings. How effective is the vaccine? How safe is the vaccine? How to use it so it is effective and safe. Another feature is that it's got hyperlinks to other areas. For example, in some cases, giving placebos can be ethically controversial, and that links to a Nature article, the HIV vaccine controversy, which is relevant. You can easily work your way back. Down here, there's a picture of the three people we're getting used to seeing on the news in the UK during the pandemic, or did get used to if you're listening to this after it's all over. More links, and then a nice ending. Are we there yet? So very easy to read. As I say, that is a slightly longer article than usual. Can't let you away without seeing one of my own. You're more likely to survive hospital if your nurse has a degree. And here we go. I don't especially like the picture here. Reinforces the female stereotype, the uniform and the hat, but nevertheless it gets the message across. It's exactly what it does, exactly what it says on the tin, as they say, a nice short title. Now this one is written by me. You can see my profile there. If you click on that, you'll find out more about me, in fact, and you might get a link to my other articles. These are published. This keeps popping up to try and encourage you to take the newsletter. Creative Commons, that means it's free to share, so this can be republished in other newspapers, and that is one of the aims of trying to get things into the conversation. Let's just click on this to see what happens if you go to my profile. Yeah, it's got a profile about me, and you can contact me. It has links to all of my articles, and it's got links to my activity as well. And there are many comments I've made on other articles, for example. And if I was logged in here, you'd see there are 69 comments on my own articles. They're not always complimentary, I have to say, but that's one thing you've got to take if you in the public domain. So this is a slightly shorter than usual. It's only a couple of pages. It's from a study that I did in Qatar, showing that when people are cared for by nurses with degrees, they are more likely to survive surgery in hospital. It's linked to other documents explaining, that you need a degree in nursing, an RCN document. It's got a picture which actually, with permission of the publisher of the original paper, comes from the paper, showing that patient mortality with the average amount of graduate education and so forth. So that's, I think, a good example, one of my own pieces. Here at Hull, we're lucky to have Mark Lorch. Mark Lorch is one of the most published, in fact I think he's the most published person in the conversation. He's a senior lecturer in biological chemistry at the University of Hull, and he's also one of our people responsible for the public understanding of science. He's now a professor. This is from 2014. It's very early. If I click on Mark's profile, you'll see just how prolific he is. Goes on and on and on. There's several pages of articles, and he does exceedingly well in getting his message out there. So this is about 5 science facts you learned at school that are plain wrong. Attractive title, people are immediately interested. It's got an interesting picture, and it says here are the 5 facts. So let's look at number 4. What region of the tongue is responsible for sensing bitter tastes? Now I have a degree in a background in anatomy and physiology, and that's what I've mostly taught within my academic nursing career. And I've always taught that there are regions of taste on the tongue: sweet at the front, salty at the back, and bitter at the side. And there's Mark there and giving a YouTube, which of course is a good thing to add into it. Apparently this is nonsense. This was something that was written in a textbook in 1942, and we've all slavishly followed it since. So I've not yet taught that particular material again, but if I do, or if I update one of my textbooks, I'll have to make sure that comes out. Interesting. And finally, just another piece by Mark, which is, I just love this piece. I wish I could write things like this. What does Spiderman eat for breakfast? Well, of course, Spiderman doesn't eat anything for breakfast because he's not real. Mark's point is, and he says, stuck in a hotel room watching the Spiderman movie, he just wondered how much protein Spiderman would need to produce those webs that he produces. This is annoying, this pop-up. He reckoned he'd need 60 eggs for breakfast for every 100 meters of silk. So he'd look like that if he ate all those eggs. So very, very interesting concept, very interesting way to get a scientific message across. So that's some examples of the conversation. I hope you'll sign up to it and get your daily bulletin. I depend on them. I don't read everything in it, but I depend on them for rapid updates, and again, especially in the time of the pandemic, to keep up with evidence. And they won't obviously publish things like anti-vaccination articles and things like that. There's certainly no scientific evidence for that, but they will publish debates on both sides of the story. So they don't just publish one side of the evidence story, but you've got to be quite clever in pitching your articles for them. So someday you may well write for the conversation. It's kept going by subscriptions. Universities subscribe to it. There's nearly all the major universities subscribe to it. It was initiated by the CommBank in Australia, and they initially set it up in Australia. It spread to the UK, America, and India, I think. I think it's only in English. All the articles are available through the Any Conversation webpage when you search the articles, but there are different articles pushed in different parts of the world, and individuals can contribute as well. And if you're a contributor, you get a little thing next to your name showing you're a contributor. Looks like Mark hasn't contributed recently. Reminds me, neither have I. So that's the conversation. Another kind of writing is the editorial, and basically a good editorial should express an opinion without being opinionated. You shouldn't come across as being arrogant or having a go at anyone personally. And The most important thing is a good editorial should be brief. And this comes from what is a good editorial, which is available on the line for these particular journals under the NCBI and NIH government set of articles. So it's worth having a look at that and seeing what a good editorial is. And now I'm going to show you some examples. Now I want to take a look at editorials, and again it's in the handout, and I've given you some examples here, four examples, and I couldn't resist giving you examples of a couple of my own editorials, or ones that are written jointly. And editorials are not dissimilar from the conversation, although they are probably more academic and perhaps less, when I say less readable, less widely applicable, because they're not aimed at the general public, they're aimed at the readership of a particular journal or at a particular profession. So they will differ slightly in the content, but the way of writing them is much the same, and the best editorials, as that previous PowerPoint said, should be short. So again, just some examples from my own editorials. I am an editor, and I used to edit this journal, the Journal of Advanced Nursing, and you'll see that we play up to the Chinese audience here, one of our major readerships and contributors to the journal. I don't edit this journal any longer, but along with a Chinese editor, we were frequently getting questions which we felt were a little bit, I don't like to use the word stupid, they weren't really appropriate, and we decided to write an editorial at least where we could address some of these points. And the point is that not everyone will necessarily read this editorial, but it's there, it's available, and we can give it to people when they ask us, and we can make it available. Being an editorial, it's open access. I should be able to download the PDF. Let's just try. Yep, the PDF's available. You can download that. So it's transportable, or you can just send the URL to people. Anyway, I was just checking on that. Anyway, you can see, people ask us about what are people trying to get published, saying what are the research hotspots, what are the most important things, and we really, don't respond well to this. There are research hotspots, but that's not how to publish. The way to publish is to write good articles about whatever you are doing. Clearly, a hotspot, as I'm speaking, is the COVID pandemic, but that doesn't mean to say that people should suddenly start writing about COVID. Although we did see a great spike in articles. What are the most suitable research designs? You may not yet be aware of research designs like clinical trials and surveys. Again, a stupid question, because there are no better designs. There are only ones that are suitable for your research. People ask for recommendations of all sorts about which textbooks should they use to best learn about writing and such like. Basically, they're looking for shortcuts. What is my possibility of being published? Never ask an editor that. Send your article in and wait and see what they say. Should we send manuscripts to editors in advance? Yes, some journals accept this, some of them don't. Don't ask editors to be co-authors. That's unethical. And some people say my article was rejected by your journal, accepted by another. Well, that's just the way it goes. How do I avoid rejection? Well, read the points above. You get the idea. Broken down nicely. It's short, a couple of pages of the internet, and you can see on the PDF that it's a very short piece. But as we say, packed full of information that we wanted to get across. There were no actual references there, but we both declared the conflict of interest that we're both editors. So that's one example. What interests academics of all disciplines is how to increase citations to their work. So here's another one, co-authored by myself and a couple of other academics, giving an idea of how to increase citations to your work, how important they are. Basically publish articles that are more citable and of more interest. Push your articles on social media, something that we're going to talk about another time, and the importance of, certainly in the United Kingdom and in some other countries around the world, of research assessment and the part that citations play there. So those are sort of informative pieces from editors, basically helping people. Here's another piece which is not co-edited by me, but co-authored, sorry, by me, but authored by another colleague, Philip Derbyshire, about fake news, fake journals and fake conferences. You may not be aware of these yet, but you will become aware of them if you ever publish. There are thousands, possibly hundreds of thousands of what are called predatory journals or fake journals, basically wanting to take your money and to publish very low quality articles. And there are also fake conferences. You get invited to these, you pay your money to the conference, and you book your hotel, book your airfare, you end up in the Bahamas or somewhere and find there's no conference on. So you just have a week off, but basically you get made a complete fool of. There are references in this article as well. And it does happen quite commonly, much more commonly than we probably know, because many academics to whom it happens probably don't own up to it. And finally, one very specific to nursing, again written by Philip Derbyshire, and coming up any minute now, yeah, and is academic nursing being sabotaged by its own killer elite? This was about a particular type of academic nurse who were not very helpful in the development of other academics. It obviously was not ad hominem. There's me using a Latin phrase. It didn't name people, but it gave examples of the kind of things that people actually do to hold other people back in their careers, which of course is not acceptable. So no other points there really to show you. Those are just 4 examples of editorials. Main point is they're kind of similar to the conversation, short, they're informative, but editorials are more geared towards particular audiences, and you may well be invited at some point to write editorials. And if you're a fastidious medical student, take a look at the British Medical Journal and the Lancet. There are other journals available, but those are the biggest British ones, and the Lancet's one of the biggest in the world. They have a regular series of editorials which are not research-based or necessarily evidence-based, but exchanging opinions and trying to push things in certain directions. You may not always agree with those directions, but it's always worth checking and reading them. So that's all I want to say about editorials. Now that's everything I wanted to say. I'm giving you my contact details here. My email are watson@hull.ac.uk. Very happy to take any comments or questions from you. If you want to know more about me, you can check on my ORCID number online, or you can scan that URL, and that'll tell you a bit about my own scholarship and research. You can follow me on Twitter if you want, and the URL and the logo at the bottom is WeChat, which is used widely in the Far East. You can scan that if you happen to be on WeChat and follow me there. So thank you very much for listening. I hope you found that useful. Once again, I'm very happy for you to ask any questions afterwards, or if I can be of any help with specific pieces of writing, please don't hesitate to ask. Thank you very much.